Hi, PerspectaWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Monday, January 14th. A lot to talk about this morning as we approach the middle part of January. I'd like to kind of give an overview of the situation where we stand right now. Of course, we had a significant weekend snow event in the D.C. metro region, for example. 10 plus inches of snow this weekend at the major airports in D.C. That's Reagan National Airport, DCA, and Dulles Airport out in the Virginia suburbs of the Washington, D.C. area. And some spots received even more than the 10 inches of snow, with 12 or 13 inches reported in places like Columbia, Maryland, for example. That particular storm was a prolonged event in the D.C. metro region. It really began mid to late afternoon hours on Saturday and continued well into last night. Much more snow south of the Mason-Dixon line, the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, as compared with north. Couple inches in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, in and around the Philadelphia metropolitan region. Now, we had a snowstorm back in November that really pounded the region from Philadelphia to New York City with several inches of snow, a little bit lesser than that in the D.C. metro region. Then there was another storm during the month of December that produced several inches of snow, primarily south of the D.C. metro region in areas like Charlottesville to Richmond. Those two events, the one in November and the snow event in December, were rather isolated snow events. In fact, the December snow was followed by 3 or 4 weeks of generally above normal conditions in the Mid-Atlantic region. I believe this weekend snow event is certainly not going to be an isolated event. In fact, it's probably just the beginning act in what promises to be a cold and stormy period for much of the central and eastern U.S. In fact, extreme cold is on the table as well. There very well could be a major storm this upcoming weekend in the transition to some very cold air that is likely to reach the Mid-Atlantic region by the early part of next week, about 1 week from now. Next Monday, Martin Luther King Day, is a federal holiday, and it could very well be bitter cold conditions by then, and the possibility exists for significant rain, ice, and or snow this upcoming weekend. Before we get to the details about the next several days, including that upcoming weekend major storm threat, I'd like to kind of go over the big picture as to where we stand right now. Again, I believe there is an extended period of cold and stormy weather coming for the central and eastern U.S. Could last right through the month of February into the month of March. Let's talk about some of the players on the field. First of all, always like to look at the Pacific Ocean first and foremost, the biggest ocean in the world, and it happens to lie to the west of the United States. And in this part of the world, the weather systems generally move from west to east, so it's a very good place to start, especially with respect to sea surface temperature anomalies. We have a Modoki, another way of saying a Central Pacific El Nino event. It's what we talked about during the Winter Outlook issued back in October, a major player here. It's not only is the magnitude of El Nino important, but the location of the warmer than normal sea surface conditions quite important. This happens to be out in the middle part of the Pacific Ocean, a weak to moderate El Nino, and that is often correlated with a colder winter in the eastern part of the U.S. If, for example, you had a very strong El Nino based in the eastern Pacific, just off the west coast of South America, that could actually flood the U.S. with warmer than normal waters. But a centrally based weak to moderate El Nino allows for the possibility of numerous cold air outbreaks to reach the central and eastern U.S. We did have a couple of times in recent history very strong El Ninos in the eastern Pacific, 1982-83, for example, 72-73, both of which were warmer than normal winters in the I-95 corridor region. Doesn't mean you can't have snow. In fact, in the winter of 82-83, it was a warm December, a warm January, and a relatively warm month of February, at least in the beginning. But we actually had one of the biggest snowstorms ever in February of 1983 in the I-95 corridor region. In fact, in Philadelphia, for example, it was the biggest snowstorm until the one that occurred in January of 1996. So even though you have a strong El Nino eastern base, still can get snow in those winters, but This year we have this Modoki, and again, it does a couple things to increase chances for snow in the I-95 corridor. It tends to activate the southern branch of the jet stream. A couple of reasons why. The warmer than normal conditions kind of add some buoyancy down in the lower part of the atmosphere, basically acts to destabilize the atmosphere, and by being warmer than normal in the water here, that releases water vapor, which feeds into, it kind of adds fuel to the fire in the southern branch of the jet stream. With an activated southern branch of the jet stream, you often see snowstorms track across the southern U.S. and even up the eastern seaboard. Also, in addition to that central-based El Nino, we have this persistent area of warmer than normal conditions here in the northeastern Pacific. This was actually kind of reminiscent of what we saw earlier this decade in the winters of 13-14 and 14-15. What it tends to do is pump up the ridge, high-level ridge in the western part of North America, and that in turn usually results in a downstream trough that allows for the transport of very cold air masses from northern Canada into the central and eastern U.S. So those are two key players right now. Again, we talked about this during the winter outlook that was issued in October. Northern Pacific blob of warm water and a centrally based El Nino. Well, another factor is the low solar activity. This is virtually a guarantee over the next few months. We are heading into the next solar minimum. And we talked extensively about there's a very decent correlation between low solar activity and high latitude blocking. High latitude blocking is a key phenomenon we like to look for this time of the year. Higher pressure, higher heights than normal over places like Greenland, northern Canada often contribute to cold air outbreaks being able to penetrate into the central and eastern part of the U.S. And indeed, we have a blank sun right now. It should be blank for much of this year. Low solar activity and its correlation to high latitude blocking should play a key role over the next several weeks in the winter coming over the next couple of months here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Well, and talking about high latitude blocking, let's take a look at the ensemble run of the GFS last night for later this month. This is around January 27th or so. It's certainly a long-range forecast, but this is a pattern that if you're a snow lover in the eastern U.S., you love to see. And again, we believe this is certainly on the table based on all those factors we just talked about. All the orange here represents higher heights than normal, and this is basically a very interesting pattern here with high latitude blocking and a ridge right along the western part of North America. We talked about that blob of warmer than normal water in the northeastern Pacific tending to pump up the ridge. Well, here we go. This is a strong ridge later this month. You also like to see, if you're a snow lover in the eastern U.S., deep trough over the Aleutian Islands, and of course a deep trough over the eastern part of the U.S. with that high latitude blocking. So this is a pattern favorable for cold and potentially snowy, stormy conditions here going forward. And again, it sets up in earnest this upcoming weekend, and it looks like it'll last into the end of January and perhaps right through the month of February. So again, this is certainly what is on the table with all those factors we just talked about at the onset of the video discussion. Well, one other big factor here is a major stratospheric warming event that started back in December and is ongoing right now. The ramifications of it will be felt, are already being felt, and will be felt for the next several weeks. Stratospheric warming events are a very interesting phenomenon, features that happen sometimes during the winter season, and they sometimes take several weeks to unfold and then can have an impact for the next several weeks. And indeed, this is a look at the temperature anomalies way up at the top of the atmosphere, 10 millibars. And what the oranges represent are above normal temperatures here for this time of the year. And we started off with generally colder than normal across parts of the northern latitudes. But then we had the stratospheric warming event that just temperatures jumped some 30, 40 degrees in many parts of the polar region here. And what this tends to do is normally there's a polar vortex sitting right on top of the North Pole. When you have a sudden stratospheric warming event, it either displaces that polar vortex to lower latitudes, or sometimes it splits it into several vortices. That is in fact what happened in this particular stratospheric warming event, a splitting of the polar vortex. And with that splitting of the polar vortex, it messes up everything in the middle and northern latitudes in terms of the typical temperature pattern, and you can displace some very cold air from the northern latitudes into the middle latitudes, and that certainly is playing a role in what is upcoming here for the central and eastern U.S. and already being felt across the North Pole in places like Asia and Europe. They've had some very cold weather. In fact, sometimes stratospheric warming events lead to cold air outbreaks first across the pole in Europe and Asia. Like last winter, we actually had a stratospheric warming event pretty late in the winter season. It first turned frigid over in Europe. They called it the Beast of the East, or the Beast from the East. Then the cold air actually extended across the pole into North America, and we had a cold March here and going into April as well. In a moment, I'll show you some of the temperatures over the last 7 days across the pole in Asia. It's phenomenally cold, and it really raises a red flag for the potential for extreme cold on this side of the pole in coming weeks. Well, one other map I'd like to show here with respect to the stratospheric warming event. This is a map of the temperature changes on a day-to-day basis going across the months here all the way into the end of last year. Look at this spike in temperature shown here in red during the month of December. Again, a change from around minus 65 degrees C up to minus 35 degrees C. This is over the polar regions from the North Pole down to 65 degrees north latitude at 10 millibars, way up at the top of the atmosphere, with a very impressive spike in stratospheric temperatures. Again, unfolding major stratospheric warming event is leading to the likelihood here of some extreme cold in coming weeks in the central and eastern U.S. Well, a moment ago I alluded to the extreme cold going on the other side of the pole right now. This is actually the temperature anomaly map at 2 meters near the surface for the last 7 days over Asia. This is Mongolia in here, Russia up here, China down here. Look at these temperature anomalies. This is phenomenal, really, off the charts here cold. And this raises a red flag when you see this kind of a thing on the other side of the pole this time of the year. The same overall weather pattern that is contributing to this may very well contribute to some severe cold on the North American side of the pole. So we'll watch for that possibility in coming weeks. But again, to me, this raises a red flag to watch out for some extreme cold in the central and eastern U.S. in coming weeks. Sometimes it happens first on the European Asian side of the pole, and then comes across to the North American side of the pole later on in the winter season. But just a phenomenal chart here showing temperature anomalies over the last 7 days in Asia. Well, a couple more charts to show before we get to the weekend storm coming for the eastern part of the U.S. This is the ensemble run of the GFS last night, 6Z, days 7 to 11. It extends from January 20th to the 25th later on this month. A very impressive, colder than normal look in the 7 to 11 day period here for basically the eastern 2/3 of the nation. Very impressive indeed. And again, this is, I believe, just the beginnings of a pretty sustained period of cold and stormy that could last right through the month of February into the month of March. Let's go to the next 5-day period beyond this. And here we go. This is days 12 to 16 from January 25th to January 30th. Just the Arctic hammer is dropped here on the central part of the U.S., extending into the eastern U.S. Again, remember, this is an average over 5-day period, and it's the ensemble run, which tends to smooth things out with time. It tends to go more and more towards climatology, which acts as a smoothing agent as you go farther and farther out in time. So this is very impressive indeed to see some kind of temperature anomalies at 10 degrees or more at this stage, at least in the northern plains here. 12 to 16 days out, averaged over a 5-day period. So again, we're headed to a very cold period, and the weekend event looks like it'll transition us to very cold air by the early part of next week. Certainly single digits on the table for the I-95 corridor region at the beginning part of next week. Now let's focus on the short term. Well, let's take a look at the next several days here. First, I want to take a look at the upper level pattern here as depicted by last night's 0Z run of the GFS model. Strung out vorticity here. Again, we talked about the stretching of the vorticity pattern in the upper atmosphere for the past weekend event that helped to prolong the event. And you might wonder, how could you get 10 inches of snow or a foot of snow in some spots in D.C. with a strung out vorticity max area? Well, a very strong high to the north is a major reason why. Sometimes all you need is a very strong high to the north. Even with a weak low pressure area, you could squeeze out a lot of snow and very cold and dry air. The high pressure helps with an overrunning surface that is very cold and dense, very dry air mass, and all you need is some moisture with a weak low pressure area or strung out vorticity, and you can get a foot of snow in this part of the country. That's why one of the first things I like to look at is whether or not there'll be a strong high to the north to determine if we'll have snow in the I-95 corridor region. But I wanted to point out that this is a strung out vorticity, and we'll see by the upcoming weekend, next weekend's event, it's not strung out. It looks like it could become a significant intensification of low pressure. Let's move forward. We also have the system on Thursday to deal with, and we'll talk about that here shortly. Here's the wave to watch for the Thursday event. Here we are midweek now. Upper level vorticity max here dropping into the first the Pacific Northwest and then the Central Plains here by Thursday. Going to be marginal cold on Thursday in terms of rain versus snow in Philadelphia, D.C., New York City. Could be a combination of the two come Thursday night. More likely snow north of the Mason-Dixon line, more likely a mix or rain south of the Mason-Dixon line. Not all that strong of a system, but enough to worry about for Thursday night time frame. Then let's move forward to the upcoming weekend. Look at this. This now is digging farther and farther to the south, and it potentially looks like that by the weekend we'll have a strong cold front along the eastern seaboard. A frontal boundary zone will kind of act as a conduit for low pressure, maybe multiple low pressure systems to move from southwest to northeast. And again, instead of a strung out area of vorticity, a very impressive trough developing here over the upcoming weekend. Still many details to iron out. Looks like potentially a rain changing to ice, changing to snow event. Now let's take a look at the surface maps from last night's GFS model run. Well, here we go. Low pressure just now pushing off the eastern seaboard. Again, it was a prolonged event south of the Mason-Dixon line with snow all the way well into last night. That continues to pull away. Moderate cold conditions for the next few days. And then we have this clipper type of system coming into the scene later in the week. Here we are in the middle part of the country now by Thursday. And again, only marginal cold here. Very well could be a mix of rain or snow or some rain south of the Mason-Dixon line late Thursday night. GFS has generally rain in D.C., but snow up maybe north of Philadelphia, up across New York City. Not a major storm here by any means, but something to watch for the Thursday night time frame. Kind of plays a key role into the upcoming weekend event as well, because it'll usher in a little bit colder air for the end of the week going into the weekend. And here we go. By the upcoming weekend, this is now the Saturday morning forecast map. Remember, we have that kind of an intensification to the upper level low with a very deep upper level trough starting to set up. Strong low pressure here. Very cold air starting to filter in from the northwest to the southeast. And here we go. This is one model run, but something to watch for. Snow, significant snow breaking out across much of the Mid-Atlantic region over the upcoming weekend, later Saturday night time frame. Again, there can be a strengthening storm, rain nearby here, maybe I-95 east. A lot of these details need to be ironed out, but again, it looks like a significant event. in the transition to some very cold air that reaches the mid-Atlantic region by early next week, Sunday night, Monday time frame, a week away from now. Here we go by Sunday afternoon. Strong low pressure, colder air starting to pour in on the west side, north side of this low. Some significant snow possibility. And here we go then by Monday morning, a week from right now, some bitter cold air. If indeed we build up the snow cover throughout the mid-Atlantic region, we could be looking at single digits for Monday morning of next week, especially more likely with a significant snowpack. That's a possibility from the upcoming weekend event. But right now, too many details to be ironed out. It looks like rain, ice, snow, all on the table for the weekend, and that transitions us to some very cold air, and it looks like this colder and stormier pattern will be sustained right through the rest of January, perhaps well into February or even March. That's it for now. Kind of a midwinter overview. For PerspectaWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.